So again, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining today's web event. Normal is normal, effective use of medical evidence in the prosecution of child sexual abuse cases. My name is William Moore with OJJDP's INTAC. This web event is brought to you as a collaboration with our colleagues over at the Zero Abuse Project. And before we get started, I would like to take a few moments to go over housekeeping items to keep in mind during today's webinar. Please note that this web event is being recorded and will be published on OJJDP's Multimedia page. On OJJDP's Multimedia page, please note that we have past web events located there where you can view that is related to juvenile justice and child victimization prevention. If you would like any supporting materials related to any of those webinars on that channel, we encourage you to please reach out to the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. If you're having any trouble accessing today's materials related to today's event, please go to the chat window and see the Google Drive link that my co-host and colleague has put in the window there. Please take a moment to click on that link and download materials related to today's web event. For optimal audio, we suggest everyone to utilize the Call Me At feature in WebEx. You'll simply go there, type in your number, and select the Join Event, and you will be connected through your audio there. Please note that your audio is connected by either, or indicate that you're connected by either the headset icon or the phone icon that's located next to your name. If you're having any difficulties during today's webinar with your audio, please feel free to reach out to me, the host, and I'll be more than happy to assist you with your audio issues. Please note that everyone has come in today's webinar on mute. You will only hear the panelist and the host during today's event. To ask a question during the webinar, we encourage you to please utilize the chat box tool. The chat box will allow for you to type any questions or comments that you would like during today's web event. However, before you hit send on your question or comment that you want to send, please be sure to select all panelists in the to field before you hit send. Help us count. If you're viewing by yourself, there's no need to type anything at this time. However, if you're viewing with a group, please go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today, not including yourself. Again, go to the chat window and select all panelists and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. Again, not including yourself. Within 24 hours, attendees will receive a certificate of attendance. Please be sure to keep an eye out on your email for the certificate of attendance. Here's the agenda for today's event. And again, just as a reminder to folks, please take a moment to complete the poll question that is in the control panel there. We will have that poll question up for just a couple of more seconds for you. I'll now turn over today's web event to Kathleen Nolan. Kathleen, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, William. I appreciate that. Hello, everybody. I say good afternoon. I'm pretty sure it's afternoon for everybody, but if any of you are logging on here now still on morning, good morning. My name is Kathleen Nolan. I am a senior attorney with the Zero Abuse Project. And for those of you not familiar with our organization, please feel free to check out our website, look into what it is that we do. But essentially, we're an organization that is dedicated to the elimination of child abuse. And one of the ways that we do that that is what we're doing today, training. We feel passionately about getting out into the field and training as many child protection professionals that we can. I have been with Zero Abuse Project since May of 2021. And before that, I was a prosecutor in the state of Illinois for about 15 years and handling all aspects of child abuse cases, child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, child death cases. That was my area of expertise when I was a prosecutor. And as I worked through my career, learning, most often learning on the job as a prosecutor, one of the things that consistently came up for me in cases was the use of medical evidence. And that is the inspiration behind this webinar, putting this presentation together to sort of put in a 90-minute presentation a lot of what I learned as a prosecutor in how effective the use of medical evidence can be. But it is a little different than most of the evidence that we use. And it's different because, as most of you that have been doing these cases for some time know, most often our medical exams are normal. That's where the title comes from. Normal is normal. That most of our medical exams on sexual assault cases are going to be normal. They're going to be normal findings. And so the use of medical evidence is sometimes counterintuitive. You think, why would I present evidence that proves nothing, doesn't show anything? And that was a mentality that I came into as a prosecutor. As a young prosecutor, I started prosecuting in 2006, and I really did sort of learn on the job. And so, thinking, why would I want to present evidence that was a negative, showing something that didn't exist? And I had the opportunity to have a conversation with an amazing doctor that was out of Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, and most of where I practiced for the last 8 years was in the St. Louis metro area. So we had access to some great hospitals. But after a trial, I had a great conversation with one of the doctors from Cardinal Glennon who sort of explained, hey, I had an exam. I did this exam. The findings were normal. There's nothing abnormal. But here's why it can be helpful and effective for you as a prosecutor to still call that medical professional, still call that doctor. And that sort of started my journey into, really digging into how best can we use this evidence, even if on its face it looks that there isn't that evidence. So that's just sort of the intro as to how I really got involved in, learning a lot, digging into the use of this medical evidence. And so, as we go through this presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics, a little bit about, the background and understanding how these, exams work, but then get into how then you can effectively use them to prosecute your case. There is a quick question in the chat asking if these PowerPoints are going to be available for download. I believe they are, but that would be something that I would defer to my OJJDP team. If they are not available, I'm absolutely willing to send them out to anybody who would request them. All right, so going through here, there is a link already. Thank you, Alicia. All right, quick couple notes before I get into the meat of everything. One, this is brought to you by our Trauma Informed Prosecutor Project, and that is a grant through Department of Justice that allows us through Zero Abuse Project to bring these trainings to you free of cost, that you don't have to pay for them. They are all provided for, again, under that umbrella of the Trauma Informed Prosecutor Project to get these trainings out to those that need them most. And quick disclaimer, none of this is to constitute legal advice. Always consult your local prosecutors or local attorneys for guidance. All right, so here is our agenda. This is what we are going to tackle in the next 90 minutes. Again, this is a topic that I could probably talk about for multiple days, but we're going to try and condense it, keep it in this 90 minutes, and then have some time for questions at the end. And as William said, if we're going through, there's something that you want to ask that's kind of relevant right in that moment, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I will keep an eye on it if I can. If I miss it or don't get to it, please feel free to reach out to me after this presentation through email, to talk about anything additional. But if you have questions as we go on, please feel free. All right, so this is our agenda. We're going to talk words matter, understanding terms, process, procedure. I get into a little bit of relevant research and applicable articles, just because sometimes it helps to have that scholarly backup to what it is that we're doing in the courtroom. talk about using medical witnesses as expert witnesses, talk about using our medical evidence as corroboration. And then the last piece, we're going to talk about actually, using some of these things in your jury selection, in your closings. And, throughout the course of this, I'll have a couple examples of, some real cases that I prosecuted that absolutely hinged on using medical evidence and using, evidence to be able to prove our case to a jury. So first thing that I want to get into is really discussing how medical evidence works in sexual assault cases. And, I understand, I'm looking at the ticker right now, right now it says 289 participants. And so, absolutely we're going to have a range of knowledge, of expertise and experience. And so, in keeping that in mind, I want to cover some of the basics, but also, get into some of the things that are going to be a little more in depth, a little bit involved. So, some of this you may, if you're a veteran prosecutor, veteran investigator, be thinking, I definitely know that. But, there's some just kind of things that I want to make sure we're all on the same page, all understand, before moving into some of the, more in-depth topics. So first off, talking about, sort of why this makes a difference, why this matters, essentially. And the picture on here, if you can't see it, this is my dog watching Law & Order SVU, as most people in America do. Most people in America, which then translates to our juror pool, that they watch these shows. They watch your CSI, SVU, whatever, procedurals are on lately. And honestly, I should start updating this a little bit more to reflecting people's viewing and listening habits. Podcasts, ID Discovery Network is on 24/7 and it's all murder shows. This is what our audience, our jurors are watching. They're watching these things that are essentially entertainment value. And that's what they're bringing into the courtroom, right? Their understanding of how cases work is coming from not necessarily an accurate lens. Think about every single SVU episode. There's always a sexual assault kit. There's always evidence. They're always calling in this doctor to testify about tearing and semen. And, it's always kind of present in these shows. And we know that that's not a reality. And so, we have to be conscious of that on a number of different levels. One, when we're thinking about our jurors and our jury selection, but, bringing into the courtroom that knowledge that jurors have some expectations. They have expectations of what they want to see, which we know sometimes isn't necessarily accurate, but they want to come in and see, the courtroom and the process and procedure. And so we know that a trial is not a show. We know that it's not something that is entertainment value, but on some level, we want to be able to deliver to a jury what they expect, what they want to see, and keeping them engaged. And this goes for medical evidence, but also so many other pieces of evidence. And the way that we try cases now is that it has to be a visual trial. We have to take the evidence that we have and be able to put it out there in a way that the jurors are going to be able to see it, understand it, and ultimately use it to convict. So, while again, we know that these shows aren't necessarily accurate depictions of what goes on, we know that that's their frame of reference. And so instead of fighting it, let's kind of embrace it. Let's figure out how we can use this evidence best and put it out there for the jury. And this particular topic today is talking about using that medical evidence. Even if you think there is not that evidence to be put out there, I'm going to show you here using diagrams, using pictures, using images that can help work through that testimony to really have your jurors hooked. They want to hear this, they want to listen to it. So give them what it is that they want to see and use it to your advantage. And so, that kind of brings me to my next point of the jury and their perceptions. They want to believe you. We ask all of our jurors, whenever we're in jury selection, one of the questions that I love asking is, to panel, jury, how many of you believe child sexual abuse, sexual assault happens? They're all going to raise their hands. And then that follow-up question, how many of you have ever seen it? Generally, no one's going to raise their hand because we know that these cases don't happen generally with witnesses. But people believe that these things happen. They want to believe that we're bringing the right perpetrator to justice for these offenses. And, they want to believe our victims. So if we can give them, again, what it is that they want to see, the evidence that they need, they're going to be able to make that step then to convict. And so, giving them that information, giving them that knowledge, and controlling that narrative from the start. And there are a number of other lectures. I have another lecture on using opening statements, closing arguments, and that really is the same concept of controlling that narrative from the beginning. But if we're talking about specifically on our medical evidence, controlling that narrative from the start of maybe there is going to be evidence testimony you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that is contrary to what you walked into this courtroom thinking. If you walked into this courtroom today, juror number 6, thinking that every single sexual assault is going to result in an abnormal medical finding, and yet you heard evidence contrary to that, would you listen to those experts? Would you listen to that testimony, even if it was contrary to what you thought walking in the door? And going on from there, that's starting to control that narrative, sort of that acknowledgement of, hey, this might not be the CSI heavy case you expected, but we're going to show you why that still works to be used as evidence, still works to be used as evidence. It's going to get you to that guilty verdict. So you don't want to wait until closing arguments. A lot of times we will have prosecutors that say, I love closing argument. It's great. It's amazing. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are fun about closings. But if you haven't laid that foundation, starting with jury selection, then you may have lost them by the time you get to that closing. So, those are just kind of a couple ideas to keep in mind. Keep in mind as we're talking through this, why it's so important to have these understandings to be able to put this information in front of the jury. All right, so your words matter. We know in particularly a courtroom, a courtroom is sort of the one place where words are so important. Every single word you say is important that you're putting out there, that you are putting in front of a jury, that you're putting in front of a judge, that you're putting in a search warrant. Words matter. We know things can be, completely invalidated with one wrong word, or saying something that, is incorrect if we misspeak, if we ask a question wrong. Just basic language, simple ways that we use different terms, different words. It matters what it is that we say. And when we're getting into medical, when we're getting into technical knowledge, we need to make sure that we are using the right words, because it does, in fact, make a difference. And so when we're talking about medical evidence, when we're talking about processes, terms, all of these things that are, really important pieces, we have to think about how we're speaking that language. And, what gets kind of interesting is, when we are talking about putting these cases in front of a jury, we think about how we're talking to them, and we want to be able to talk in a way that they understand. And, we want to be able to use words and phrases that make sense. And I have found one of the best ways to be able to do that when I'm talking medical evidence is, when I am meeting with my doctors, when I'm meeting with my nurses, I go into that meeting understanding I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I am not anything even remotely close to a scientist. I went to law school so I wouldn't have to do math. So, I go into those meetings with that mindset of like, I don't know everything. And I certainly don't know as much as this doctor. And so, doctor, nurse, and I'm sitting down with you, when I'm asking questions, okay, about this process, about this result, whatever, explain it to me like I'm 5, like really break it down, Dr. Nurse. So then I can take those same words, those same phrases, those same concepts, and be able to pass them on to the jury in a way that makes sense. And so, we're still keeping in mind, consciously, yes, we need to make sure we're using right terms, words, language, but then being able to pass on that language in a way that makes sense is going to make your presentation to the jury so much more effective. So when we're getting into our medical exams and talking about our medical exams, and when we are talking about who needs a medical exam? There's, a couple different conversations to be had, and this is, when your words and terms matter. So overall, a medical exam, a child who has disclosed any sexual abuse of any type, there's a good argument that any child who's made a disclosure is entitled to a medical exam. And this is what gets in a little bit to our words matter part, in that, we may be talking about different types of exams depending on when that disclosure has happened. So we know that if it's an acute disclosure, meaning this is something that has happened relatively recently, the hours are always kind of changing as our trace evidence collection tools get better. But generally, we're talking, within 120 hours, if this is a disclosure that has happened, then we want to have an acute medical exam, which generally involves that sexual assault kit. We're having kids being brought to a facility, an emergency room, to have that acute medical exam conducted, that sexual assault conducted. But even our kids who have delayed disclosures, even something that is happening beyond that, acute time frame, we still want them to have a specialized medical exam. So again, kids who have disclosed sexual abuse of any type, regardless of when that disclosure has occurred, regardless of when the activity has occurred, we still want to give them the opportunity to have that medical exam. And I'll talk in a couple slides, about the benefits for that. But again, any child who's disclosed sexual abuse of any kind, we want to, encourage to get an exam. Nonverbal children who are in a risk of harm environment. So, this can be your babies, your infants. This can be, children that have, an IEP that are not necessarily verbal, have other delays that they're not verbal, but they are in a risk of harm environment. Maybe these are siblings of a child who's disclosed abuse. Maybe these are kids who have come into care because of allegations against parents. Those are the kids that we want to make sure are medically safe. Children who've not disclosed abuse, but abuse was observed or interrupted. I, unfortunately, through my career, have had a number of these cases where kids have not made any type of disclosure, but someone maybe walked in on something occurring, maybe saw some text messages, maybe saw some videos, images that show that there is something happening, but child has not disclosed yet or is not in a place to disclose yet. Those are kids we want to refer for a medical exam. And then the final piece, a child who's not engaged, or sorry, who is not disclosed, but engaging in risky online behavior. So these are, again, our kids that are maybe, chatting with people older, talking, making videos. And what we find a lot, and I'm sure, those of you who have done this have seen, a lot of times when kids are being urged, enticed, solicited online to create videos, to create images, they're often being urged to do things with objects that are not necessarily designed to be inserted into different parts of children. And so, we can see sometimes some, medical issues there because of, using things in those risky online behaviors that aren't designed to be inserted. And so, we want to be conscious of that with those kids as well, making sure that they are medically safe and medically looked at. So, this is just to go over that kind of wide range of possibilities as to why every child that is engaged in our child advocacy centers that is coming into an investigation, a case, is arguably entitled to a medical exam. And this is to another one of those issues that comes up, depending on where you're located. I have trained in rural areas who will tell me that, if they have an acute case, they need to drive an hour 45 to get to a location where they can have this type of exam. Those of us that are in more metro areas are incredibly lucky to have the access to the resources and facilities that they have. And so, this is something that is worth talking through with your team, talking through with your multidisciplinary team of a protocol. How can we best serve the needs of these kids that are coming in to get them this exam, to get them to be able to have this medical exam. And again, arguably, every child that comes into a center is someone that we should be working towards getting a medical exam. And so this is supported by research. This is a little bit of getting into some of the research, but this is an article. This is an article that was published in 2010 called The Role of Medical Provider in the Evaluation of Sexually Abused Children and Adolescents. And this was one of the first articles that really started looking at medical providers, physicians' roles in child abuse cases. And why, this sort of shift in looking at their role was happening was because, there are a number of doctors who were starting to have this specialization, especially the specialization in child abuse, in child abuse pediatrics is not something that has always been around. It's only been within a recent time frame. But we have these doctors who are working in this field that are starting to see regularly that the exams that they're doing are not coming up with those abnormal findings. They're having normal findings. But the doctors, nurses, physicians, providers were seeing that their role was incredibly important, that the medical provider is able to be involved in this process, have that exam that occurs, finding that there is generally not physical evidence of abuse, but they're able to provide some really important pieces. And this is the support for why every child that comes in is entitled to a medical exam or should be getting a medical exam. And it's because that medical provider can answer some of these questions that are always going to be on the minds of families, on the minds of kids, that if they're brought in to see the doctor and kids know something's going on, even if they don't quite grasp this investigation and what's going occurring, they know what happened to them, and they know that there are adults that are concerned. And when there's something going on with you, something going on with your body, you want to hear from someone that you're okay. And so these doctors, these nurses, medical providers that were involved in these cases really started to embrace that benefit of, sure, these exams may be normal, but we're going to be able to tell these kids, so are you. You're okay. There's nothing wrong with you. We know something happened to you, but no, the kid sitting next to you on the bus can't tell that something happened to you. There's nothing physical about you that people are going to know that this occurred. A lot of times there are questions about things like sexually transmitted diseases, about pregnancy, concerns that kids and families are going to have, that having a doctor answer that is going to go really far to making them feel like they're okay. Even though they experienced this, even though they experienced what has happened to them, that a doctor has said that you're all right. And so, that really is one of the biggest pieces underlying the argument that all kids are entitled to a medical exam when they have disclosed sexual abuse is being able to hear that they're okay, that their body is okay, they're safe, there's nothing wrong with them. That's a big piece of it. We're going to get into the using it as evidence in a little bit, but we want this process to be trauma informed. We want kids that have gone through this to be able to come out of it having their questions answered, having their fears about what has happened to them answered by a medical professional. And it's been really great to see 2010 forward, physicians, doctors, nurses getting involved in our multidisciplinary teams because of this understanding. I'm going to skip the next slide here just in interest of time. And, as we go through this, you're going to get the deck. There's a lot of slides that are in here that I might jump over just because of time constraints, but, you will have access to all of it. So continuing on with that, who needs a medical exam? And this is that same article that I just referenced before, but talking again about the role of these of doctors and talking about their role, the medical exam and its spot in our investigation process. And we know that ideally the medical exam is happening after our forensic interviews. If we have a child who is coming in, with an acute report and they're reporting immediately to the emergency room, sure, that full forensic interview is probably not happening. But, when we have delayed disclosures and we have a little bit of time, getting child in for that forensic interview is going to be immensely helpful to our doctors, our nurses who are conducting these exams, because they're able to know why it is a child's coming in there. Our medical providers that embrace a multidisciplinary team approach philosophy know that the reason that we have our child advocacy centers is so that kids aren't re-traumatized by being asked the same set of questions over and over again. The whole point is to have one interview, one person that's asking all of those questions that's going to cover all of the information. And so, if we have that forensic interview, before that medical evaluation, it is really helpful for our kids, going forward in this trauma-informed process, but having that information for our medical providers. And, if we have a situation where that can't happen, where the exam is happening, in kind of real time, our doctors, nurses are really conscious of this trauma. And so they're not necessarily doing, very intense questioning. They're going a little bit more into what it is that what they need to get right that moment. But they're asking, as minimal questions as possible to be able to effectively do their exam, but not have further trauma or further issues with the child. So, that knowing that, that process is so important to that medical exam will help the doctors, nurses do their job, fulfill their role. And so, knowing the results is going to be able to help doctors, nurses be able to answer those questions, the questions that they may have, the questions that our kids may have. We want to give the doctors, nurses the best tools to be able to answer those questions. And so having that understanding, having that understanding of what has happened at that forensic interview is helpful for our nurses, doctors, physicians. But it's also helpful for our team, our multidisciplinary team, to have a good understanding of, the process and why it's so important to then send our kids on, our families on to that medical exam. And so this is a different study. This is a different article that was published in oh no, I'm sorry. This is still the same one. I was looking at my notes and I had skipped ahead a little bit. So this is still our 2010 role of medical provider. And this gets into something that is incredibly helpful, incredibly important for our multidisciplinary teams that work, one-on-one with our kids and our families. And, this was something that looked at the trauma of the actual exam. And this was a study that looked at 119 girls who had no history of sexual abuse, but they were having this physical exam, routine physical exam, that involved the use of a colposcope. And the use of the colposcope in these exams was done, and then these girls, the girls that were part of the study, were asked about the experience. Was this a bad experience? Was this negative experience? And the girls that had this exam, no reported history of sexual abuse, but girls that had this exam, only 7.7% of them rated that exam as somewhat negative or negative. So out of 119 girls in this exam that happened with the colposcope, only 7.7% said that this exam was negative. So why is this important? What does this mean? And it goes to our, knowing our words, knowing our processes, knowing our procedures. So many times when we talk to families, we talk to parents and say, we want your child to go get this medical exam. They have a really negative response, a really kind of, like, I don't want to do this because I don't want to traumatize my child further. We know a lot of parents immediately assume that what these medical exams involve is similar to a pap smear. That's what adults have in their head of what this looks like. And, we all, those of us that have gone through it, know that it's relatively traumatizing. It's not easy. It's very difficult. It's very uncomfortable, sometimes very painful. And so that's what parents are thinking. I don't want to further traumatize my child. I don't want to send my child, out into, a medical situation where they don't understand what it is that's happening. And so, one of the key things to understand here is, one, what does this word, this colposcope word mean? If I'm in person, sometimes I ask show of hands, who knows what a colposcope means? A little tough to do in the virtual world. But a colposcope is the piece of equipment that is used to conduct these exams. The colposcope is what they are using to conduct the exams, and this is what the colposcope looks like. So this is what a nurse once told me was a giant microscope on wheels. That this is a piece of equipment, and this is one that has been used for some time. They're getting more and more advanced. There's more things that are happening that are developing the technology, but this is generally what they look like. It's on wheels, so it can move around, and the main piece of it is magnifying. It magnifies the structures that are being looked at, whether it be a girl's genitalia, boy genitalia, looking at anuses, all of those pieces of the exam that are happening. It's using this piece of equipment, and that exam is done in a way that makes the kids comfortable, that makes them able to be a part of that process, and not feel trauma, not feel invaded. And the way that this piece of equipment works is to really make that exam something that is not going to be traumatizing to them, not going to be difficult for them. And a lot of times, again, the thought is that this exam is going to be done in a way that is going to be difficult for them. And we want to be able to explain to parents, to families, these are the things that are being used. These are the equipment that's being used, not necessarily something you're thinking. Kristen asked in the chat, how old were the 119 girls in the Culposcope survey? Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly how old they were. They were all juveniles, would all have been under 17. So I can double check though and look for you and get you an answer exactly on a date range. Off the top of my head though, I don't know exactly how old they were. But knowing the use of this equipment is going to really help you with parents, with families. And so this is a piece that can be used by our child protection, by our multidisciplinary, our child advocacy center victim advocates, our case managers that are working with our families, talking with their families, to be able to talk through and explain what does go on at these medical exams. Knowing what that colposcope is going to be able to give you a better idea to explain, here's how this goes. And this can really go far to alleviating parents' anxiety. I had a case a little while ago before I left full-time prosecution to come into Zero Peace Project that was an acute case. Basically, this was a stranger perpetrator. He convinced the family member of this little girl to allow him to come pick up this little girl and her friend, go drive to a park. He sexually assaulted girl, brings them back, and the friend that was with, they came in the door, and friend went to grandma and said, hey, this just happened, reported it right away. And so mom or grandma reached out to this little girl's dad, and they called police. And the patrol officers that responded, it said to the father of this little girl who had been assaulted, hey, we need you to go get a medical exam. Unfortunately, they didn't kind of take that next step of saying, okay, here's how this is going to go. It's going to be okay. The nurses, doctors really do a lot to make sure your child's comfortable, even though we're talking an evidence collection type situation. And that dad, immediately went to, traumatic experience, immediately went to, I don't want to subject my child to this. And so he didn't go, and he didn't take her for that exam. And it was absolutely in the time frame that we very likely could have found medical evidence. And thankfully that case worked out. A guy was convicted. It was all right. But it was one of those situations where had that officer been better equipped to explain, to talk through what would really happen, that could have really helped in getting that evidence. And so being able to talk through and explain why these things are so important, for our families is great. And then, taking that next step, we're then going to be able to explain better to a jury, how these work. So, getting in touch with, talking with, having, good relationships with your medical professionals, medical providers, going to go really far for that. A lot of times I really enjoyed, or would always encourage, if we could, essentially taking field trips with our multidisciplinary team to our hospitals, to where our sexual assault clinics were located at. Obviously we're never going to watch an actual exam happening, But if we can understand the facility, like we understand, okay, here's the waiting room. Here's where, we then bring kids in for the exam. Here's the table. Here's the colposcope. Here's where the doctor explains everything that's going to happen. A lot of rooms now are equipped with the big screens, with TVs. If child wants to watch live their own exam, they can. If they don't want to watch, great. A lot of colposcopes are equipped with the ability to record, to take pictures, those types of things. And talking through, hey, this is what's going to happen. This is how this is going to go. This is how you're going to lay. If we can see that, if we can visualize that, it makes it, again, easier for us to explain to our families and easier for us to explain to our juries. So knowing how then that exam works is really, really going to be key to be able to explain to a jury, being able to explain to families what it is that's going to happen. And then going on, continuing with that, sort of words matter concept. We want to be able to speak the same language, to be able to talk about our medical structures, our diagrams, talking about anatomy in a way that is accurate and correct. For those of you that have seen a large number of Child Advocacy Center interviews, we know that kids say all sorts of crazy things when they're talking about, their genitalia, when they're talking about their body. But it's so important for us, as prosecutors, for us working in this field, that we're using the right words, that we're using the right terms. And it makes a difference when we're talking to our doctors and our nurses. And then it's going to make a difference in charging decisions, as well as what we're able to put in front of the jury. And so, understanding how basic biology, how the human body works. I say that, and sometimes it seems, pretty counterintuitive that, of course, we should all know how this works. But we know in reality, a lot of people do not. A lot of people really don't understand what it is that we're talking about when it comes to genitalia, particularly female genitalia. And if you don't understand it, and someone on the jury doesn't understand it, then there's a likelihood that maybe you don't get a conviction because you're not able to effectively, accurately talk about, explain what's going on. And so what this sort of leads into then is, in that concept of words matter, being comfortable using words that may be uncomfortable. Someone asked me when I was a kid, do you think your job when you grow up is going to be talking to strangers about sex? No, probably would not have thought that. But, at the end of the day, that really is what we as prosecutors do. We're standing up in a courtroom. We're asking strangers, what is your knowledge about, this particular area? Let's talk about sexual assault. Let's talk about medical evidence. We're getting into topics, we're getting into concepts that generally aren't dinner party conversation, that aren't, things that people are just talking about over dinner. Again, if you live in a household with a child abuse prosecutor, that is all you talk about. But, these are the things that people generally are uncomfortable discussing and uncomfortable getting into. And so if you are also uncomfortable with those words, it kind of carries that, like, okay, maybe this isn't something to be taken seriously. Maybe this isn't something to be believed in. And so, we want to be strong in our knowledge, be strong in our ability to discuss, these sometimes uncomfortable words. And, we know when we are talking about our charging decisions, and I'll get into this a little bit with the conversation about penetration, that it really does make a difference when we are talking, difference between vagina, vulva, those are different parts of the body. Those are different structures. And we know that the vagina is often described as sort of the totality of female anatomy, and that's just not true. Every time I see someone say they took a picture, or she took a picture of her vagina, I'm like, well, then she probably had a colposcope, because there's no way you can see the vagina from outside. Like, it is an internal structure, and that makes a difference. It makes a difference for charging. It makes a difference for our phrases and our terms. And it makes a difference with what our doctors are putting in their notes and their findings. And so, looking at the ways that we can use this information in front of a jury, we get into, then let's find some good diagrams. Let's find some good ways that, as we're having our doctors, nurses going through how they are doing their exam, what they're looking at. We need to make sure that everybody understands that we're all talking about the same thing. We're all on the same page. And so, again, I use the opportunity to reach out, hey, doctors, nurses, give me good diagrams. Give me things that I can use, to show, have you talk through your testimony. And so, if I am a prosecutor and just saying vagina over and over again, and it's talking about a number of different structures, then we're not going to be on the same page. We're not going to be talking about the same things. And, oftentimes too, when we're talking about our boys, we need to be able to have an understanding of how biology works, how the body works. And, unfortunately, this is something that happens a lot of times with our little boys, is that, it's that they're experiencing sexual abuse and their body may betray them. There's just some biological responses to sexual abuse that can happen. And, we need to be able to understand that, to then, if you have a case where maybe there is that response, that your nurses, your doctors can talk through, why that's normal, why that's something that happens, that has nothing to do with, arousal, attraction, that it's just something that occurs. And so, having that understanding, being able to use diagrams, being able to use your words with those diagrams are going to help, start to finish. Let's go through that medical process, going through that procedure, and then, really talking about our structures, what it is that we're discussing and what it is that, we're wanting to get out there. So, that's sort of why our words matter. There's a point in the chat that I think I really agree with, and Jamie, I'm glad that you said that. But the point in the chat was thinking about medical exam and how that medical exam is also an opportunity for medical professionals to model and discuss consent with youth in a safe space. Just continuing to create those safe spaces. Our medical providers can do really good work to, continuing that conversation. So thanks for dropping that in. I agree. All right, so relevant research, applicable articles. So this is, a little bit of a piece that gets kind of heavy as far as, giving you this support. But why I like it is, I feel like a lot of times I spend, when I'm having conversations with police, with judges, all of these people that we interact with, there's a lot of things we talk about, a lot of things I say. And, I want to be able to say, this isn't just me, judge, this isn't just me, detective. I'm not just saying this. There's stuff to back it up. There's research, there's articles, there's smarter people than me have dug into this from an educational, scholarly concept. And it's supported. So, giving a little bit of that background can sometimes help, you frame your arguments, but frame your support. If you don't believe me, believe the American Medical Association. We've got some backup for you. So this is particularly helpful when we're sort of getting into the meat of this. And so, why these exams are normal, why overwhelmingly normal is normal, why overwhelmingly our exams, even sometimes with our acute exams, are going to be, a normal exam and not have any abnormal findings. So first is sort of the nature of the abuse. What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about our child sexual abuse? And, this absolutely gets into that perception of our jurors, that jurors assume when we say, child sexual abuse, child sexual assault, are often thinking, these, horrifyingly damaging, bloody, assaults. And we know a majority of our cases are not that. And that's for a number of reasons. So, most of the time our perpetrators are going to be known. They're known to our families, they're known to our kids. I can count on, I think I would need 2 hands, 2 feet, fingers and toes to count my true stranger victim cases in, the course of my career. I would not have enough appendages to count the known perpetrators, because that's generally what this is going to involve. A family member, a friend, a babysitter, a teacher, a priest, a scout leader, a band leader, all the people that are interacting with our kids. They're generally going to be the ones that are abusing our kids. And so what that means is that they don't want it to be obvious. They want to be able to continue their access to kids. They want to be able to continue doing what it is that they're doing. So they don't have that motivation to hurt and harm the child. They don't want to leave permanent marks. They don't want to have, something that's going to be very clear and glaring, sending this child back to their parents, that there's abuse going on. So that nature of abuse just in and of itself is likely not going to result in, some type of injury and some type of, visible medical issue. And so, just that nature of the abuse is going to not result in injuries. Oftentimes, too, we're going to have, even if we're having something that is occurring that maybe is causing some redness, maybe something that caused, some type of tear, the body heals itself in that area. When we're talking genitals, when we're talking anuses, that part of the body, the parts of the body that are there start to heal really quick. I had a nurse once explain that it was sort of like, the inside of your cheek or the inside of your lip. When you bite that, it hurts, but it starts healing pretty quick. Within a day, you might not even notice it anymore. It's definitely gone within a week. And that's sort of like those structures, they start healing very fast. And so, even with the nature of abuse, sometimes the fact that there might be some physical manifestation of that abuse, it disappears quick, it heals quick. The perception of penetration, and I sort of alluded to that in one of the previous slides, that you have jurors that come in thinking, again, if we are proving penetration, that we are talking, again, like full, penis inside vagina, like that is the only way that we prove penetration. But we know that our legal definitions of penetration are pretty broad. Most 50 states across the country, most have something similar to kind of the any intrusion, however slight. I did actually pull all 50 states and their definitions of penetration. I would not bore or exhaust you all with going through that list, number 1 to 50, including Puerto Rico, but they all have pretty consistent definitions, and it is that any intrusion, and it often involves, different body parts. There can be different parts of kids that are being penetrated that aren't just, necessarily sex organ, necessarily anus. There's a lot of different interpretations of how penetration can occur, but because those perceptions of, penetration that oftentimes people have exist, knowing that these exams are happening through a wide range of behaviors that would never cause any type of injury or wouldn't leave any marks, explains why those exams are overwhelmingly normal. And then the last piece gets into our issue of disclosure. That we know what we know about dynamics of abuse is that disclosure oftentimes does not happen immediately. The cases I've had with acute exams have often been because someone saw something, someone walked in on something. The example I gave just a little while ago about the little girl at the park, it's because her friend that was with her went home and told her grandma, like, this just happened. I've had cases where mom has walked in on something. I've had cases where a friend, was present at the same party and saw something going on. Those are oftentimes the ways that we have these acute cases. And so knowing that so many of them are that delayed disclosure also helps to understand why these exams are normal. And this starts to get into, using this type of evidence in a way that proves the negative. That if you have a disclosure, if you have a child saying, this happened to me, but the last time something happened was 3 weeks ago, well, then it's going to make complete sense for a nurse or doctor to perform an exam and find it to be normal. That is consistent with what our child is saying. That's consistent with their statement that, doctor, would you be surprised to find any physical manifestations of this assault 3 weeks later? Yes, I would be surprised. Why is that? Well, research shows us all of this, healing, and that yes, it would be very surprising to see that evidence 3 weeks later. So the child's disclosure saying this happened 3 weeks ago is consistent with my findings. And so, the fact that so many of our cases are that delayed disclosure, using that medical evidence to corroborate their statements shows that they're being truthful. What they're saying is accurate. So a couple studies here that are helpful to support some of this. So this is the kind of early normal is normal study. This is 2002. This was a study on 2,384 children that were being evaluated for possible sexual abuse. So these were kids that came into a medical facility, medical provider with a disclosure of abuse. And in those, 2,300 some kids, normal exams were only in 4%. That there are only 4% of those kids. Again, ages, I'm not exactly sure. I would say that the age range would have been, generally any kids that are going to come into the emergency room under, that 17. But the number of abnormal exams was relatively small, 4%. And so, part of this study too, it started to move forward that concept that the history given by the child, that the information in the child's statement was really an incredibly important diagnostic feature, that it wasn't necessarily the results of the exam that were going to be the most important, but what the child was saying, what the history was that they gave. This is another one that is really great that I love to use. So this is a study, genital anatomy in pregnant adolescents. Normal does not mean nothing happened. So this was 19, I don't have the date on here, but this was a study that was done on 36 pregnant adolescents. So these are adolescents, a little bit older, 12 to 17 range. And we have 36 that are part of the study. We know it's tough to do research on kids, let alone, pregnant kids, pregnant teens. But this took, the sample size of 36 pregnant adolescent girls. So why does pregnant matter? Pregnant shows that there absolutely was penetration. We know that something has happened because they are pregnant. They are showing the results of that penetration occurring. And of those 36 adolescent teens, only 2 had genital changes that were diagnostic of trauma. So, kids that we know something has happened to them, only 2 had that abnormal finding. And then this one, it talks about using the examination findings in legally confirmed child sexual abuse cases, normal to be normal. This is 1994. This is a little bit earlier, but looking at 236 children who had disclosed abuse, and then the perpetrators actually convicted. So these are kids that came in for medical exams. The exams were conducted, and we have sort of, again, that hard evidence that something had occurred because we have a conviction. This is an age range of 8 to 17 years of kids that were looked at. There is a number of things that were reviewed, your case files, colposcope photos. And again, in those cases, abnormal findings, 14% disclosing penile genital contact. Only 1% had abnormal anal exams. We talk a lot about our genital contact, but our anal exam cases are just as a similar of a concept as far as, talking about it being normal. That in this particular study, only 1% had that abnormal anal exam. And this talked about the fact that our significant factors that were contributing to an abnormal exam, some type of physical finding, was time since last incident. So that, that's our acute time frame, as well as if there's any blood reported. And so that's, definitely interesting, definitely something that, would be indicating that there is some type of, painful trauma, some type of injury occurred. But overall, the fact that abnormal findings are not common, and that more emphasis should be placed, on what kids are telling us, what kids are saying through the course of this investigation. Then last little study here talking about, again, those abnormal anal exams, anal findings in children with and without probable anal penetration. This looked at 1,115 children. 2013 is the date on this one, and reviewed these charts. 84% girls, 16% boys, 198 children were classified as an anal penetration group. And there were several features that were found to be significantly associated with anal penetration, that variations in the data occurred with the disclosure and the manner of exam. And so, again, there's some benefit, a lot of benefit to getting the statements from our kids, actually seeing what our kids are saying, that exam may not necessarily yield an abnormal finding. All right, so I want to go into talking about our medical experts as experts, and how they can present this, how they can put this out there as good testimony for our cases, for our jurors. So, using our medical experts as our medical witnesses as experts is going to help put a little bit more information out there, a little bit more of substance and support to what it is that our witnesses are saying. And so, thinking about a couple different ways that we can use those medical experts and how they fall into, our legal considerations. And I'm going to skip up a little bit here, but we want to be able to present the testimony of our witnesses as treating experts. That they've actually saw this child, that they're giving an testimony about the child themselves. They're not just looking over records. And so, we want to be able to have them testify, but testify as experts. And it can be a little bit different depending on which jurisdiction you're in, whether you're in a Fry or a Daubert or Daubert state. But most jurisdictions are going to allow your medical professionals to testify because their education, training, and experience is above that in an average juror. It's above that of what most jurors are going to walk into that courtroom knowing. They're going to have specialized training. They're going to have more extensive education. They're going to have continuing education. All of those pieces that give you that expert designation. And so when we're calling those witnesses, we also want to think a little bit broadly too, because a lot of this can come in, even though there may be hearsay prohibitions, when we're talking that medical exception to hearsay. It's sort of a broad area, a broad umbrella as far as who is covered under that medical testimony. So obviously your doctors, nurses, but maybe we're thinking first responders, maybe we're thinking paramedics, social workers, looking a little bit beyond, just the strict concept of our medical providers, nurses, doctors. But when we're calling our witnesses as experts, how we can work around some of those issues that we might have right up front with evidence as far as hearsay. And so knowing that we can use some of these exceptions is going to be helpful to getting that information out there, because again, we're looking for our witnesses who have medical experience, medical knowledge, and they're going to be able to use that medical knowledge for diagnosis and for treatment. And again, they are testifying as treating experts. These aren't they may require you to give them a fee or give them a subpoena fee or something, but we're not just hiring them as consultants. They're not just outsiders. They're people that actually have treated and engaged in treatment with this child. And so when we're arguing or putting forward that we are going to use these witnesses as experts, you want to be prepared to put that in front of, either in front of the judge to argue that this is relevant evidence, and then to eventually put it in front of the jury. So, you want to be able to meet with your witnesses, go through your medical records early and figure out who it is that you want to call, who it is that you want to talk to. A lot of times you're going to find that you think, hey, this is, absolutely, I need this doctor and this nurse. And then you go and sit down and talk with them and realize, what, I can just call one. Or they're going to tell you, actually, here, this page on the report you missed, that's who you really want, and then you're looking to amend your witness list and figure it out. But, when you get that understanding early, it's going to help you move that case forward. And then you're going to be able to get the information that you need that's going to give you the support that they are experts, getting their CVs, getting their resumes. Some every now and then, I'll have someone that's maybe a little bit newer that hasn't put together a CV or a resume, and this is a great opportunity to do so. But, putting together a document that shows their education, their training, their experience, all of that just enhances the fact that these are experts. They're doing something special. They're doing something that requires extra knowledge and expertise, and it's imperative for the jury to hear them. Another good point is making sure that you have an understanding as to, titles. And if you're in a jurisdiction where, you need to make that request of the judge, where the expert is being tendered, I tender this witness as an expert in pediatric nursing. I tender this expert or this witness as an expert in the area of child sexual abuse dynamics. Whatever it is that you're tendering, make sure that you know what it is that you are tendering them as, because you want them to be in agreement and not say, wait a minute, I'm not comfortable with that designation, because that could look pretty bad. And so, thinking about how then you can use these witnesses to help you, how you can use these experts to move your case forward. And so going back to that discussion of why words matter, why those diagrams, why knowing, the different body parts, genitalia, why knowing the process and procedures. So then you're going to use these experts to go through this medical evidence. And again, thinking in light of the fact that most of our cases are going to be a normal exam, we can still use these medical experts to talk through process procedure. Yes, they did come in for an exam. Here's why we would not expect to, find any, physical evidence, any semen. It was a delayed disclosure and happened, a month prior. We still did an exam. Here's why we think it's an important thing to do an exam. And then, having your witnesses go through all of that, it helps to answer questions. It make sure that there are no sexually transmitted diseases, that there's no risk of pregnancy, answer any questions from the family. And then, even though we are a month out, we still want to examine structures because it's consistent in what we know about abuse to have a normal exam. And, doctor, what were the results of that exam? Well, it was normal. Were you surprised it was normal? No, I was not. Can you explain to the jury why that exam was normal? And then you take it, sort of that next piece in our legal definition. So again, talking about, the concepts of penetration, let's go through these diagrams. Doctor, we're looking at a diagram here of the structures of, the genitalia of a, similar to a 6-year-old child, which is similar to the child that we have as a victim in this particular case. And, these are the different parts. Can you go through, doctor, and, show what you looked at, what you observed, and, doctor, this, here, and how this works. And, a lot of times we're having them explain, how the structures work, and, how it's imperative for kids to do, some of these, things when they are doing the exam, to be able to actually see structures, to open things up. And so, doctors, some of the, structures that we're seeing, that we've heard, discussion, explaining how then you would be engaging in an active penetration if you needed to, insert anything inside any of these structures. And, we need to be careful how we're asking the questions, because we don't want the objection to be raised of, us essentially, substituting the knowledge of the jury, or being substituting the knowledge of the doctor for that of the jury. But, we can ask questions in light of what we know are legal definitions are, knowing what penetration means, knowing what assault means, and having the doctors work through and explain, why what the child's statement of touching, tickling, rubbing would all qualify as penetration based on the information that they are providing to the jury using these diagrams, using the statements made by the child, using their exam. So, you use it to support your legal definitions, which then you go back in closing and use that information to argue it. And so, using that medical evidence and through your witnesses, through your experts, is really going to help as far as corroboration. And so, we know corroboration is huge with our child abuse cases. Again, going back to that concept of usually these things don't happen in front of an audience. We don't have people that are actually seeing child abuse happen. So we need to corroborate our kids' statements. And, knowing that there's that sort of general agreement that most often at times these exams are going to be normal, we want to be able to use the fact that these normal exams don't rule out abuse, that they, even if there was some type of injury, it may have healed relatively quickly, but that normal finding corroborates what our kids are saying. And so, even if we have this normal exam, we're using this expert testimony to explain to the jury why that's expected, why it would be normal, and why that normal finding completely fits and is consistent in light of what the child is saying. And so, when you're analyzing your child's statement, looking at what kids have said, that, if the abuse is happening in a time frame that's outside what you would expect to find any type of medical evidence, you're using that expert to support their statement, to corroborate their statement. And so, oftentimes we can get a lot of information about time frame from our kids and from their statements. When we're looking at, some of our digital cases that involve grooming, messages, texts, chats, let's look and see, time frame of when these things happened. Same with, pictures. If we're getting a little more high tech with location data, let's figure out, if child's saying, I'm not really sure when the last time was that something happened. Let's get sort of that firm time frame, figure it out, so then we can ask that question to our doctors, to our nurses. Doctor, you reviewed the the forensic interview done in this case, and child could not remember a specific date when this abuse last occurred. Is that consistent with your findings? Yes. We, however, were able to get some information as far as timeline, and learn that this happened 3 weeks ago, 6 months ago, a year ago. Doctor, knowing that this abuse happened a year ago, is it surprising to you that this exam is normal? No. Why is that? Going on, continuing, with the conversation. So, really what we're doing is pulling information out of victim's statement to be able to use that normal finding as probative evidence, as corroborative evidence of what it is that they're saying. Just another piece of evidence showing that what their statement is worthy of belief. And so, that time frame is incredibly helpful for using that medical evidence as corroboration. We've talked a little bit about, or a lot about already, as far as why it's normal to be normal. Why it's important to understand that trauma begins to heal relatively quickly. But another huge piece of this that can be really helpful in using your medical experts is getting past this third little bullet point here, the hymen myths. And this is another one of those concepts, another one of those things that a lot of people do not understand what a hymen is, how it works, and what its existence or non-existence actually means. This is one of those ideas that a lot of people come into a courtroom, thinking that there is going to be, this absolute evidence of, some type of sexual assault because something hymen. You still hear these cases where people are saying, well, I wasn't actually sexually assaulting that child. I was just doing a virginity check. I was just trying to look and see if that was still intact because that proves it. It's all nonsense. And you need sometimes your doctors to testify and talk about that. And, it goes back to that knowledge of biology and knowledge of what it is that we're truly talking about. And a doctor can explain, depending on age, for our littles, the fact that their hymen is still in existence. One, it is not a solid anything that goes across. I mean, we know that kids couldn't pee, if that was true. But, it's not just this solid structure, and that it looks different for every kid. But also that for our prepubescent kids, any kind of hitting, touching on that hymen is going to be really painful. And so, that can be corroborative of our kids, our little prepubescent kids saying, something rubbed up on them and it hurt a little bit. Even if there is not penis going inside penetration, finger going inside penetration, sometimes that rubbing, touching, tickling can cause pain. So explaining, the fact that on our prepubescent kids, that area is still really, really sensitive, painful, in a bad way, explains why, again, you might have an issue of tickling, touching, rubbing, that it could be painful. And then as our kids get older, having your doctors, nurses explain, how the hymen essentially it's estrogenized, it becomes puffier, it becomes more fluid, and it's no longer painful. Even kids that have had some type of sexual penetration occurred, they may not have any change to their hymen, depending on how advanced along through puberty they are and how estrogenized it is. So there may not be any pain, and a lot of times there is no dramatic breaking. It just kind of gets absorbed back into their body. And so, these are some of the myths that a lot of people come in to court thinking, having in their minds. And so we want to be able to combat a lot of those things and a lot of those concepts. And when we have these doctors, nurses, professionals, they really can help, move that needle, be able to explain what it is that we're truly talking about. So the next part here, I'm going to give a couple examples of how this helped in real life. On the materials, I think you might have access to some videos, and just in interest of time, I'm not going to play the full videos or the 911 calls at this particular portion, but I want to talk to you, just give some examples of where this mattered. So, first example here, this is sort of the time frame that we're talking about, and this is a time frame in an acute case. So scenario is that mom returns home from work late at night, approximately 11 o'clock, finds 5-year-old daughter and her live-in boyfriend in her bedroom. And it's kind of suspicious, doesn't look right. So mom ends up taking this little 5-year-old into the bathroom. Girl says it hurts to pee. Mom sees a mix of something in child's underwear that looks to be something blood and something else, another bodily fluid. And so, mom's response here was she calls 911. She was concerned about what just happened. And the way that the 911 call plays out is the call comes in and the dispatcher says, we're really busy. We don't have anyone to respond. Can you just wait for a call back? And so unfortunately what happens then in the time while she is waiting for a call back, a perpetrator is still in the home, and he starts, working on her as far as like, you didn't see what you actually saw, this was a mistake, there's really nothing going on. Sort of it gets in and does, what we know a lot of perpetrators do, is really trying to talk their way out of it. And so then what happens is she calls back and says, it's okay. We figured it out, no big deal. And the dispatcher says, oh, okay, great. Well, thanks. Have a good night. That dispatcher was fired. So it worked. That part worked out. But, the hero of the story, and anytime I tell it or talk about it, is absolutely, at the time, patrol officer Manny Espinoza. He's now a sergeant for the Alton Police Department, but absolutely was like, there's something up here and I need to talk to this lady. So he ends up calling mom back saying, I want you to come and meet me. Come and meet me and let's talk, walk across the street to the Casey's. I want to see what's going on. And mom, again, had thankfully put this pair of underwear in a bag and walked it across the street to the officer, who said, hey, this is something, I appreciate he told you it was no big deal, but let's, we need to have this girl, we need to have your daughter examined. We need to get her to a hospital and let's work this case and move forward. So, and that was a case that, the investigation proceeded, and we had a great result. We ended up having to go to trial on this particular case. The little girl had to testify, but it was a great result in that, it ended with a relatively hefty prison sentence. He was sentenced to about 30 years in prison. And it was key that the officer understood, why that medical evidence was going to be really important and going to be really relevant to what it is that was going to be put out there. Next example, next little case scenario here. Again, this is a case where medical evidence is incredibly important, but in a delayed disclosure concept. So another 5-year-old girl tells grandmother she doesn't want to see her Uncle David anymore. He touches her privates. Mom asks some follow-up questions, gets some additional details. The CAC interview is conducted, and she discloses this, discloses to the interviewer, touching, tickling, rubbing, and her sexual assault exam, her sex exam is normal. This is a bit of a delayed disclosure. So in light of that, we conduct an investigation. We go through that investigation, and there is an interview then that takes place of the offender. And, we actually do have I forgot this clip is a little bit shorter. So William, let's go ahead and play this clip from the actual interview of the suspect in this particular case.
Yes, we'll do. And before we play the video here, just want to remind the audience, when you have your speaker on or your computers on, please make sure that your speakers are indeed enabled in an effort to make sure that you are able to hear the audio coming from the computer. And Kathleen and other presenters, just make sure that your computer is also muted, or at least your phone is muted there. Perfect, there we go. All right, we will play the video.
All right, so this is an example of a couple really great things. So first off, it's a great example of the cognitive distortions that we know perpetrators and our offenders get into, and our detective in this particular case really leaned into that because this guy is agreeing with him and what he's saying, and he's framing it in a way of like, you're not that bad, you're just doing this and this and this, and so he's using that cognitive distortion. But then the detective is using the knowledge that he has as far as what our legal definition of penetration is, to get him to make these admissions and to say, yes, that's what I did. That's the behavior that I was engaging in. And there's that little piece in there that I'm not sure if you caught it, but where he said, I've been really trying not to touch her at all. These are some great admissions. And, that's just a 1-minute clip out of this probably about an hour plus statement. And, the detective really went into it, with a knowledge and understanding of, I need to use this statement to corroborate what this little girl is saying, as far as it's tickling, touching, rubbing, why that matters, why it's considered penetration, and, the fact that everything that she said was accurate. And it was a great statement. And really the only thing that was at issue in this particular case was the question of penetration. And it was a big deal because the difference between a sexual abuse charge, which does not include penetration, a sexual abuse charge was a probationable, maybe day-for-day prison sentence. Even if you go to prison, it's only for a few years, versus a mandatory prison 6 to 30 sentence at 85%. It was a huge difference between charges and what the jury was going to convict. So we knew, going into this interview, why it was really important to be able to get that evidence and those admissions. And so, then in this particular case, we used the statements made by our little girl, statements made by defendant, and then used our nurse examiner to talk about, why what our little girl was saying was consistent with the normal exam, but also consistent with the definition of penetration. And so, child testifies at this trial as well, gives some good details, gives some good information, but then, our pediatric nurse examiner really pulled it together and was able to, testify and give some terms, phrases, information for our jury to kind of hang on. And so this little clip here, if you can't read it, this is actually from the transcript or the excerpt of the appeal. This went up on appeal, was affirmed, and this is information from one of our pediatric nurse practitioners that talks about this issue with what a hymen is, and talks about the fact that this is something that needs to be understood when we're talking about the exam. And the prosecutor may specifically ask the nurse if a normal exam means that sexual abuse did not happen, and Kristen L replied, no. In fact, in my reports I always state that although there is no permanent physical injury, sexual abuse can still occur. So this was testimony that the appellate court hinged on as being important, and why it goes to showing that element of penetration. All right, so last piece here, we're going to get into just wrapping up, talking about using these concepts in jury selection and in closing, and then we'll still have a few minutes at the end for any questions anybody has. All right, so I've referenced a couple times, how important jury selection is. It's one of those topics that I am totally obsessed with, and I will talk to you all day long about jury selection, but jury selection really is the start of when we start to frame our case. A lot of times prosecutors think the first engagement they have, the first meaningful engagement they have is openings. It's not, it's jury selection. That's really the only time you get to have a conversation with your jurors. And sure, there are some jurisdictions that are a little restrictive, don't let you go in depth as much, but if you can, this is where you want to start laying that foundation. So thinking about, what are some of your issues, problems, obstacles, and what can you do in jury selection to address some of that? So, thinking about everything we've just discussed, that concept of, if you've come into this courtroom thinking what penetration means, thinking what consent means, thinking, you have an idea in your head of what law or what information, evidence, should be there. Asking jurors, if you've come in with that understanding, but as you go through the course of this trial, you learn something different. You hear testimony, you hear evidence that says your understanding was not accurate, whether it be to a definition, whether it be to a concept, whether it be to, state of science. Well, you listen to that testimony and maybe change your understanding. Are you willing to be able to get into these concepts, but maybe adjust your understanding. You want to talk to your jury, sort of bolstering your witnesses. If you've got a great institution, if you've got a great hospital, like I did with my Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital and Children's Hospital in St. Louis, ask, hey, do you have any experiences with this? And generally, it's going to be relatively positive. You want to bolster that, support that. If you came into this courtroom thinking a particular way about how medical evidence should exist, biased, and you want or you are going to listen to these experts that are going to explain away some of those preconceived ideas. Are you going to listen to that expert, or are you going to hold on to your opinion? And so then, asking some of those questions early in jury selection and then using this evidence through the course of the trial tees up for you your closings, your end piece, and how you're going to use this to argue. And so, you're going to be able to then take all that information in closing and use it to argue, why those concepts, again, jurors, as you came in here thinking this about medical evidence, now you know different. And now you know that a normal exam is normal and that the normal exam corroborates our child's statement. You came in here, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I asked each and every one of you if you would follow the law. Now you know that the law on penetration means any intrusion, however slight. And we've proven through the testimony, through the medical experts, through the evidence, that the child here disclosed acts of penetration. That's what the defendant is charged with, and that's what you should convict them of. Those are the things that then you're pulling back into your closing. You're using these different pieces of evidence, these different concepts to build that wall. And that's why I have a picture of my brick wall in the back here. That you're using all of these pieces and you're using all of the evidence to build that wall. The argument being that, we've shown you this, child told you this, we've shown this is truthful, this is accurate, this is supported by the evidence. And when you put it all together, you have that foundation, you have that support for that conviction, for the fact that this defendant is guilty of the charges that they are facing. And so, this last example here is an article by Victor Vieth, our Chief Program Officer, that talks about, using this sort of medical evidence, using the concept or the fact that, it's kind of ridiculous, pulling everything we know, that a child would have this education, would understand, if I'm going to fool the jury, then about the lie I'm making up today, I'm going to have to allege some sort of sexual contact that won't produce medical findings. Kind of going on that, like, hey, how does our kid know, only disclose something that's going to be supported by the medical evidence. And then last quote here, which is incredibly kind of inspirational for the things and the work that we do. The importance of closing argument cannot be overstated. It is at this juncture of the trial that the prosecutor becomes the voice of the child and the victim's last best chance for justice. The prosecutor who rises to this occasion serves both the child and the profession with honor. And, so you want to do that. You want to wrap up and be able to, pull in your jury instructions, pull in your evidence, pull in everything that you have to then argue, hey, we talked about this at jury selection. We've talked about this through the course of the trial. At the start of this case, I asked each and every one of you, if we proved each and every element beyond reasonable doubt, what would your verdict be? And you all said guilty. We've now shown you that. We've used the evidence. We've used what we have to support that, and your verdict should be guilty. All right, and that is it. This is a slide just with a couple of our training opportunities, our website, my email, which I know everybody has. William, do you want to do your housekeeping and then I can do a couple of quick questions, or is it vice versa?
It would be vice versa. Maybe I think we did get one question, and so since we have 2 minutes, if you do want to address that one question that came in, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so the question was, if your team is having the medical provider watch forensic interview with law enforcement for purposes of preparing for the medical exam and child is aware provider is watching, can that forensic interviewer also testify under hearsay exception? So, for that, it can be your hearsay exceptions definitely vary by state as far as when our forensic interviewers can testify about the totality of it. But I think in this particular situation, if you had your your medical expert in as part of your MDT and would be able to say, yes, that interview was happening, I was observing because it was going to be part of my diagnosis and treatment, I think there's a good argument that your forensic interviewer then would fall under that medical hearsay exception. I know there are a couple states that have only a medical hearsay exception, and so need to get a little bit broad as far as when that can be used. But I think as long as your medical provider can say that interview was happening for diagnosis and treatment purposes, there's an argument that it is under that hearsay exception.
All right. Thank you very much, Kathleen. And so that being said, it is 4:29 p.m. Eastern Time, and so I'm going to go ahead and close us out really quickly with just a few last minute housekeeping items for folks to keep in mind before they exit. I see people leaving the virtual room. Prior to leaving, if you could, please take a moment to go over into the control panel. You'll see under the control panel underneath the polling tab, if you click on it, there's a poll that we have up. If you could take a moment, just complete this poll, we would appreciate it on our end. But just really quickly, a reminder to folks that within 24 hours, you will receive a certificate of attendance. So please be sure to look out in your email for that certificate of attendance. As I mentioned during the beginning, please be sure to contact Intact through the URL that's listed below. And we also encourage you all to sign up for our listserv as well. If you would like to have any information about the TTA help desk or JuveJust in any upcoming web events, we encourage you all to please reach out for the help desk if you need assistance getting access to any of the materials, things of that nature. But then also go to OJJDP's website underneath the respective subsites and subtabs there to get access to information about JuveJust, upcoming events, and things of that nature. Uh, we would also encourage you to please go to OJJDP's Multimedia page, where you can easily find other web events related to juvenile justice and child victimization prevention. If you would like supporting materials for any of those webinars, please again feel free to reach out to the TTA Help Desk, and we'd be more than happy to get that to you all. Please note that we have a couple of other additional webinars that we have coming up, including our webinar this Friday with in our Preventing Youth Hate Crimes and Cyberbullying series that we have. Please note that this webinar is only for law enforcement personnel, so we please ask for folks to register for that. And then we have the next webinar in our Zero Abuse series that we have coming up on October 5th. We encourage you all to please register for that webinar as well, coming up in about 2 weeks. And then we have another webinar coming up with our colleagues with Zero Abuse again, coming up on October the 19th. We encourage you all to please to continue to attend these webinars as well and register for them. They are active and ready for you to register, so please do so. And then finally, we do want you to please connect with OJJDP. You can connect with OJJDP through these multiple channels that you see here. Again, thank you all for a wonderful for your time today. Kathleen, thank you for a wonderful presentation today. That being said, I'll close this out. Everyone take care and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.